Let's move straight to our top story. The heart of government was like a dumpster fire. That is the bombshell statement from Boris Johnson's aide-turned-enemy, Dominic Cummings, who's been giving evidence to the COVID inquiry today. The former chief advisor to the Prime Minister, who was fired back in 2020, accused the government of widespread failure over pandemic decision-making. At one point, he was asked about the plans to protect vulnerable people. And this was his harrowing response.
I would say that entire question was almost entirely appallingly neglected by the entire planning system. There was effectively no plans or any plan even to get a plan for a lot of that. As you could see from the evidence, one of the most appalling things of the whole enterprise in lots of ways was on the 19th of March when we realised that there was essentially no shielding plan at all. And the Cabinet Office was trying to block us creating a shielding plan. I think there was a brilliant young woman in the number 10 private office called Alexandra Burns who tried to raise warnings about things like wives who are being abused and children in care and a lot of similar things. And I don't think the system ever properly listened to her.
Also giving evidence today was Boris Johnson's former Director of Communications, Lee Kane. He told the inquiry that the ex-Prime Minister was the wrong man to lead the country through the pandemic.
I think what will probably be clear in COVID, it was the wrong crisis for this Prime Minister's skill set, which is different, I think, from not potentially being up to the job of being Prime Minister. So I think he's somebody who would often delay making decisions, would often seek counsel from multiple sources and change his mind on issues. Sometimes in politics that can be a great strength. I think if you look at how he navigated Brexit, he allowed others to make decisions and jumped in the last minute, can take political advantage. I think if you look at something like COVID, you need quick decisions and you need people to hold the course and have that strength of mind to do that over a sustained period of time and not constantly unpick things, because that's where the problems lie. So I felt it was the wrong challenge for him.
Absolutely extraordinary, the wrong challenge for Boris Johnson's skill set. As if you get to choose the challenges that beset you in life. Joining me in the studio now, former advisor to Boris Johnson, Alex Crowley. Good to see you, Alex. And political correspondent at The Guardian, Aubrey Allegretti. Thank you for coming. And we're also joined by Hugo Rifkind, columnist at The Times, down the line. I mean, the whole thing is so extraordinarily mind-boggling, unless, Alex, you're someone who did work there and might find this a very familiar description of your daily life at work.
Yes, when I saw the clips just now, I didn't find them particularly shocking. I know a lot of people will have done. Let me describe to you what a normal day in government looks like. Yes. at a general level, because I don't think people quite realise this. You start in the morning and a decision is made to do something, whatever that is. You then mainly spend the rest of the day trying to stop that decision being unpicked by various actors at play. It could be the Whitehall machine, it could be other politicians, it could be the media. Then you get to the end of the day and you haven't quite ended up in the place that you started, but you were there more or less, and then another day comes, and another day comes. That's a normal day when there isn't a crisis happening. When there is a crisis happening, that is obviously a terrible way to conduct the government of this country. The story we hear emerging today is one where you had a pretty unlucky mixture of Boris Johnson, who had many great political strengths, but I agree with some of the testimony there. This was not the challenge for him, perhaps an accident of history, coupled with a Whitehall machine that is in many respects still stuck in the Victorian era with how it processes information.
In terms of taking a long time.
And how it makes decisions, but it takes a long time, doesn't prepare for things, spends far too much time fighting with the other department because that's their little turf war that they've got going on, and so on and so forth. You put those two things together in a once-in-a-generation crisis, a fast-moving crisis, and I'm sorry, but that's the picture that emerges from the testimony today.
Well, but I don't know which of the many things said today at the inquiry really jumped out at you or caught you by the throat, but I can tell you the one that jarred most with me, and that was the bit where it was said that Boris Johnson wasn't unduly worried about the elderly or vulnerable because, hey, they were going to die pretty soon anyway. That seems an incredibly callous and borderline psychopathic way of thinking about the elderly and the vulnerable, doesn't it?
Yeah, I think there were two moments that stood out to me. That was certainly the first, because it sort of represented a feeling that we'd heard and that was rumoured among some people in government, and indeed some people in the Conservative Party, but today was really confirmed for the first time. And we saw how much Boris Johnson seemed to be sort of in hock to his own party, and how that delayed his decision-making and influenced it, how he was rattled, for example, by an interview that Keir Starmer gave that was favourably written up in the Daily Telegraph, that he then started instructing his officials that they were taking the wrong path on lockdown. I think the second sort of most interesting feature of today was the written evidence that we saw by Patrick Vallance, because Boris Johnson has sort of almost no skin in the game anymore. He's no longer even an MP. And there are people who are still in government today who were during the pandemic, the two most senior being Rishi Sunak, who was then the Chancellor, and Simon Case, now the Cabinet Secretary. The testimony from Patrick Vallance saying that the then Chancellor Rishi Sunak blocked support payments for poorer people so that they could isolate, so that they could afford to isolate instead of going to work, because they obviously had to go out to try and pay the bills. They couldn't afford to isolate. That, I think, is some of the most damning testimony as well.
Yes, let's bring Hugo Rifkind into this. I mean, I suppose it's safe for me to ask a question I wouldn't normally ask, which is, which of the revelations today appalled you the most? Because I think I can be reasonably confident that you won't have found it a congenial revelation in any particular. Are you appalled by any of it? If so, which bit most?
I mean, appalled is a tricky word. I would say it's still going on. I believe he's still there. The most recent thing we've heard is that Dominic Cummings blocked Boris Johnson on WhatsApp shortly after they stopped working together, so cross was seen. Look, I mean, this is all appalling, but none of it is surprising, right? At the time, it's hard to think back to that time, because it was such a strange time, that early period of COVID, early period of lockdown. But at the time, it seemed like they were in a free-fall panic and didn't know what to do. And that is indeed the case. Dominic Cummings talked today about this growing cascade of nightmares they were having, and this sort of sense that there was nobody competent to run anything. That very much seems to be the case. And for me, it's like the real sort of scandal here, the real shocking thing here. It's not so much how they were behaving and how they were carrying on and how they were failing to deal with this crisis while it was unfolding, because we knew that and we sort of expected that. The real scandal is that these people were the government in the first place. No one ever thought they were a competent government. They were the dregs of government that were sort of put in after the sort of Brexit fiasco had wiped out a generation of the Conservative Party. We knew they were a terrible government.
A delightfully pneumatic majority, though, and with Boris at the helm, and many people thinking that was a walk in the park for the country. People were greeting it with great ebullient enthusiasm at the time. It wasn't considered to be a government that had crawled in wretchedly through the back door at all.
Absolutely, but that's not my fault. I mean, they'd driven out the competent wing of the Conservative Party on the basis that they were Remainers. A lot of their majority was to do with people just being sick to the back teeth of Brexit, which was a scandal that not a scandal, but a fiasco that they brought about. There was also a massive anti-Jeremy Corbyn vote, of course, as well. But the point is that, I mean, nobody believed this to be a fiercely competent cabinet beforehand, and they simply just sort of proved that theory absolutely right.
Well, I'm going to ask you all the same question, just because I'm very curious to know what the answer is. If I start with Alex, this is the wrong skill set for Boris Johnson, a pandemic. Yeah. So what would have been the right skill set for him, the right challenge for his skill set?
Well, let's start by, I can answer that by looking at why did Boris have the wrong skill set for this? The reason why is because his nature was to always leave people guessing about what he thought on issues. Okay, now as a journalist, that works in your favour. As a politician working in the bars of Westminster, that works to your advantage. As someone who needs to make quick decisions in a fast-moving crisis and to be able to stick to them, that is the totally wrong mindset to adopt. You can't have a situation where the Prime Minister of the day is leaving everyone guessing and is also, frankly, susceptible to being influenced by the next person that comes along. What you need in a leader, and we haven't had that in this country for a very long time, for both parties, is someone who kind of knows what they think, takes the advice on board, chooses the path, and then sticks to it. Because when you're a leader, if you choose a path, inevitably there'll be 15 other people that disagree with you or want you to do something different. And they'll all be sniping at you saying, no, you should do that, you should do this. And it's incredibly hard for any leader to do that.
What is the challenge he would have risen to with the perfect skill set? What should the challenge have been? I mean, pandemic, obviously inconvenient and unwelcome. That wasn't the right challenge. What would have been the right one?
Well, let's look at his political successes. His political successes were getting the Brexit deal over the line. Whatever you thought of that, where the country was in summer of 2019 was a complete constitutional mess. His ability to leave everyone squabbling, come in at the last minute and say we're going to do it like this was to his advantage then. The decision to back Ukraine very, very strongly in the early days of the war was to his advantage and was as a consequence of him choosing a thing to really get stuck into and setting the agenda for that. He was very good at that kind of big picture stuff. But the detail, as everyone knew when they elected him, by the way, was not his strong suit. And he didn't have a system that was able to guide him either.
Okay, Aubrey, what would have been the right challenge for Boris, and what do you make of his head of communication saying this wasn't the right challenge for his skill set? Extraordinary thing to say about the Prime Minister, isn't it?
It is, and I mean his skill set seems to really be the sort of election-winning formula. He was so much the sort of poster child of that election. It was all about him and what he was going to do, all about Boris's team and what he represented in the sort of communities that he could inspire to vote Conservative for the first time. When you speak to Conservative MPs now, they just sort of say he squandered such a big opportunity. He got such a big majority. He could do those big election wins. He pulled off the feat in City Hall, managing to become a sort of two-term Tory mayor, which some people hadn't thought was doable. He could do all the election wins, the bravado, the sort of the selling people stuff, but the delivery of it was really where it was faltering.
Yes, so let's bring Hugo into this. Hugo, there would have been a different crisis in which he might have excelled.
I mean, look, you can see why Lee Kane wants to say that, because otherwise he's got to explain why he ended up working for him in the first place if he wasn't going to be good at anything ever. I do sort of struggle with this myth that's sort of based around this idea that Boris Johnson must be brilliant, so we've just got to figure out precisely what he's brilliant at. I suppose, yes, he's good at the speeches, he's good at the rhetoric. I'm not particularly impressed with someone who's just good at winning elections, because winning elections isn't sort of serving the country in itself. Winning the elections is just sort of doing the thing that you need to do if you're then going to do something meaningful. I suppose he was strong on Ukraine. Boris Johnson, as a wartime leader, provided he was actually doing what his generals told him to, might actually not be terrible in that way that he sort of dreams of being, in that Churchillian way. But as everyone says, this was exactly wrong. This involved deferring to experts, understanding experts, just listening to experts, none of which he's really capable of doing.
So as this unravels and unfurls, I think to most people's horror, Alex, what are the consequences? What is the purpose of this inquiry anyway? I mean, we have long waited for the outcomes of various inquiries and uttered that hideous phrase, lessons will or must be learned, only to forget what the lessons were, to forget what the content of the inquiry was, to lose interest, a quarter of the way through. What is the purpose of this one? Because no one goes to prison, no one gets punished, no one gets arrested, nothing ever happens. What's the point of it?
Yeah, and the purpose should be to understand what is it about our way of governing that needs to change so that when the next one comes along, and there will be a next one, we are much better prepared to handle it regardless of which politician we elect. That's what it should be. However, I suspect it will tail off into, who sent what WhatsApp to whom and what colourful language was in it, and which politician shall we blame for failure X, Y and Z. Singapore, as a counterpoint, have already concluded their COVID inquiry. They've published their recommendations and they are now in the process of implementing them. And by all accounts, it looks like a very sensible set of recommendations. And we should move much quicker than we're moving.
So this is a slow and ponderous process. We're not quite sure what the point of it is. Each syllable uttered makes you feel more and more wretched about what could have happened, what should have happened. And very soon on the programme after the break, I'm going to be talking to a doctor who lost her own father to COVID. And, these are genuine consequences for so many families all over the world. What are we doing here? What is the point of this?
Well, pandemic preparedness, as we were hearing from Dominic Cummings today, sort of went into this black box, and there wasn't really much accountability or scrutiny of how good plans might be and also how good the delivery of those plans would be. So I think you've got to sort of look at those two aspects, both the sort of planning for, but also the delivery of. There is also an element of closure that you want to try and afford to some people. I mean, they've suffered for this for years, and it feels like with each new harrowing detail, really it's going to compound a lot of their sorrow. But I do think it helps to see in black and white that there were, for example, fingers being pointed at the former Health Secretary, Matt Hancock. I think later on in the evidence today, Dominic Cummings was saying he thought that Matt Hancock was responsible for lots of deaths in care homes because the testing wasn't being ramped up quick enough. All of those kind of revelations, I think, will make people feel that their anger is justified.
And Hugo, we'll never know whether he really thought that at the time or whether he thinks it now with the benefit of hindsight, will we?
We were supposed to be the best prepared country in the world. We did indeed have some of the best experts in the world, the best scientists in the world, the best medical experts in the world. We were like sort of pivotal in developing vaccines. On the sort of scientific side of things, the infrastructure side of things, we were kind of brilliant. The lesson here is that politics matters. It's not a team sport where you pick your side and you back it. You've got to have really serious, competent, clever, capable people in government. Otherwise, it's just irresponsible. And I'd hope the lesson we take out of COVID is if you are irresponsible in the government you choose, and we as a country were, this is what you get.
And as one of the things suggested is that Boris Johnson, Dominic Cummings, and this very tiny coterie of people wanted to implement, or maybe already had implemented, a way of governing which essentially kind of evaded, avoided and exempted all the traditional means of doing it. So the COBRA meetings, the red boxes, the general protocol, the bureaucracy, the tiers and echelons of the civil service, which are the ways in which these things are tempered. And you said earlier, well, it was a pandemic, it was pretty urgent. There was a kind of medieval system in place. Maybe they were right to try to find a way of circumventing it, or were they?
Yes, they were. The biggest fallacy in this country is that the politicians we elect run the government, and they don't. The officials run the government, and the officials have some sensible processes and some processes that just get in the way. And we've got to decide as an electorate, do we want politicians to actually run it, or do we want them to be figureheads and largely ceremonial? You could go either way. There's a healthy debate to be had there. But I take the view that if you're going to have ministers in charge, they need to actually be in charge. And if a process isn't working, you need to change it.
And Aubrey, following this inquiry, is there any likelihood of change?
I think there will have to be. I mean, Heather Hallett, who's the chair, has proved very sort of tough and vociferous. We saw in the battle, the showdown she was willing to have with the government about all of these COVID WhatsApps that the government was initially trying, well, not all, but some of them it was trying to withhold.
Unless you're the Scottish government.
Unless you're the Scottish government, quite. But she proved that she was willing to take the fight to the government in court to win it. I suspect that shows that she has a determination to really sort of stick with this to the end and make sure that it does have some impact and change for the better.
And Hugo, is there any truth in the rumour that you're only talking to me down the line and not in the studio because you had another brush with COVID, that it's yet again darkened your doors?
Yes, indeed. I had my fourth bout of COVID over the weekend. It wasn't terrible. It was the best of the four, I'd say. The first was pre-vax. That was pretty awful. This one was pretty mild, but I also felt it would be unfair to come into the office even now. So maybe tomorrow.